A woman trained to disappear. A dinner reservation that was never meant to end in dessert. And a single sentence, spoken too early, that will decide who leaves the room alive. In a chandelier-lit Chicago dining room where wealth pretends to be civilized and violence wears tailored suits, Hannah has perfected the art of silence. But tonight, silence is a death sentence. 30 seconds stand between her and catastrophe, because the man with the inked throat doesn't know he's already been marked, and the woman at his side is counting down his final breath. What happens when the invisible witness sees everything? And what kind of woman risks her life to shatter a lie built on blood? Welcome to Silent Speaks Stories. We don't tell loud stories here, we tell the dangerous ones. The moments where one choice fractures fate and obsession takes root. This isn't romance you recover from. This is the kind that ruins you beautifully. Stay close, because once Hannah speaks, no one at table 1 survives the truth. Hannah had been trained to see the things others ignored. 3 years ago, before her father's health collapsed and the medical bills became a weight she couldn't carry, Hannah had been the top candidate for a government intelligence program. They had called her the Oracle for her freakish ability to decode human behavior in real time. Now that training was being used to pour sparkling water, but as she approached table 1, the old instincts flared like a fever. Seo Jin-wook sat with his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline spread behind him like a jagged, glittering carpet. He was the center of gravity. His sharp features and the subtle neck tattoo peeking above his tailored suit marked him as a predator who had survived 1,000 hunts. He looked cool and deliberate, but Hannah saw the tension in his jaw. A man who knew he was in a cage, but couldn't yet see the bars. To the left, Valentina was the picture of old-world glamour. Her auburn hair was styled in a vintage bob that caught the amber light, and her pearl-drop earrings swayed as she tilted her head. She looked distracted, her gaze dipping toward her phone, but Hannah noticed the way the woman's thumb was rhythmically tapping the side of the device. It wasn't boredom, it was a countdown. "More water, Mr. Seo?" Hannah asked, her voice a low, melodic silk that didn't invite a reply. "Please," Jin-wook said. He didn't look up, his attention fixed on the menu, but his posture was straight and impeccably styled, radiating a controlled intensity that made the air feel thin. As Hannah leaned in, the crystal carafe in her hand, she didn't look at the guests, she looked at the reflections. The table was polished obsidian, a dark mirror. Beneath its surface, held just below the level of the white linen cloth, she saw the glow of Valentina's phone. On the screen was a real-time tracking interface. 4 red dots were converging on the blue dot that represented table 1. 1 was coming through the service entrance, 2 were in the lobby, the 4th was already in the room, wearing a server's jacket that was half an inch too short in the sleeves, a man who didn't belong to the house staff. Hannah had 25 seconds. Her internal logic fought a brief, violent war. She could walk back to the kitchen and be out the back door before the first shell casing hit the floor. But she saw Jin-wook's eyes, dark, cold, and strangely solitary. He was a man about to be slaughtered by the people he trusted most. She didn't shake, she didn't gasp, she simply finished pouring the water, her expression calm, professional, and self-assured. "The nightly specials are written on the reserve card inside your menu, Mr. Seo," Hannah said, her voice steady. "I highly recommend the bitter greens. They help clear the vision." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small black table reserved card. As she placed it on the table, her fingers brushed against Jin-wook's for a fraction of a second. She felt the heat of his skin, the controlled intensity of a man a second away from a grave he didn't see coming. Beneath the card, hidden from Valentina's view, she had scrawled 7 words on the back of a receipt. "The Auburn fox has signaled the hounds." She felt him stiffen. He didn't look down immediately. He was too smart for that. He kept his gaze on the menu, but Hannah saw the muscles in his jaw set even harder. He was processing the shift in the air. Valentina's thumb pressed the screen in her lap. The signal was sent. The waiter with the short sleeves was 10 feet away. Hannah stepped back, her eyes lowered in quiet focus. She wasn't just a server anymore. She had just declared war on an empire behind a water carafe. And as the first shadow of the assassin fell across the white tablecloth, Hannah knew the silence was over. The waiter with the short sleeves was no longer a distant threat. He was a predator closing the gap, his eyes fixed on the back of Seo Jin-wook's head. Hannah could feel the air pressure in the room shifting, the way it always did right before a storm broke. Her pulse hammered against the high, stiff collar of her blouse, but her hands, those professionally poised hands, remained steady as she set the carafe down on the service station. She had 10 seconds to bridge the distance to table 1 without triggering the alarm bells of the compromised guards at the bar. If she ran, she was dead. If she screamed, she was dead. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, heavy card made of black cardstock. Embossed in gold foil was a single word: reserved. Hannah stepped back into the flow of the dining room. She didn't look at the assassin. She didn't look at the traitors at the bar. She moved with the upright and composed posture of a woman whose only concern was the perfection of her floor. Valentina was still looking at her phone, her thumb poised to send the final execute command. Jin-wook remained cool and deliberate, his jaw set, his fingers tracing the edge of the leather-bound menu. He was waiting for something, a sign, a sound, but he was looking in the wrong direction. Hannah reached the table just as the short-sleeved man reached the pillar 5 feet away. "Pardon the interruption, Mr. Seo," Hannah said, her voice a calm professional anchor in the rising tide of violence. She leaned over the table, her body momentarily obscuring Valentina's view of Jin-wook's hands. With a flick of her wrist, she slid the reserved card onto the obsidian surface, pushing it directly toward his left hand. Beneath the card, held in place by the tension of her thumb, was a crumpled credit card receipt. She had used a grease pencil from the server station to scrawl 7 words in jagged, frantic script. "The Auburn Fox has signaled the hounds." Jin-wook's eyes didn't move from the menu, but Hannah felt the moment his hand covered the card. His skin was burning hot against the chill of her own. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, not the gaze of a server and a guest, but the raw, electric connection of 2 people standing at the edge of a cliff. He didn't gasp, he didn't flinch. The controlled intensity that defined him simply sharpened into a lethal edge. "Is there a problem with the table, Hannah?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Just a change in the floor plan, sir," Hannah replied, her eyes lowered in quiet focus. "I suggest you look at the specials before the kitchen closes." Valentina looked up then, her defined brows snapping together in a frown. "What is this? We didn't ask for a reservation card." "An error from the host stand, ma'am," Hannah said, already stepping back, her heart performing a frantic percussion against her ribs. But she didn't rectify it. She turned toward the kitchen, her mind already calculating the nearest tactical advantage. Behind her, she heard the soft click of a safety being disengaged. Jin-wook had seen the note. The short-sleeved man stepped out from behind the pillar, his hand emerging from his waistband with the dark, heavy shape of a suppressed handgun. At the bar, the 2 guards stood up in unison, their hands reaching for the weapons hidden beneath their blazers. "Jin-wook," Valentina's voice rose, a high, panicked note that was entirely fake, the sound of a hunter pretending to be the prey. But Jin-wook was no longer sitting still. As the first shot hissed through the air, shattering a crystal wineglass at the neighboring table, Jin-wook exploded into motion. He didn't dive for cover. He grabbed the heavy obsidian table and flipped it with a roar of pure, channeled rage. The invisible eye in Hannah's brain didn't freeze. While the rest of the dining room erupted in screams and the sound of breaking glass, she was already reaching for the industrial fire suppression pull station hidden behind the silk curtains of the server bar. She looked back one last time. Jin-wook was standing behind the overturned table, his neck tattoo stark against his pale skin, his eyes fixed on her. He wasn't looking for a way out, he was looking for her. Hannah pulled the lever. A deafening hiss filled the room as a cloud of white, freezing Halon gas erupted from the ceiling, turning the old-world glamour of the Obsidian into a blind, white purgatory. The silence of the server was over. The War of the Serpent had begun. The world vanished into a blinding chemical frost. The halon gas roared from the vents, a pressurized scream that swallowed the sound of the second and third gunshots. It was a dry, heavy fog that tasted like static and old metal, instantly turning the opulent dining room into a white void. Hannah didn't wait to see if the assassins would fire blindly. She knew the layout of the Obsidian better than she knew the lines on her own palm. Every step was muscle memory. She dropped low, her pristine white apron dragging against the plush carpet, and crawled 3 paces toward the center of the room. A hand, large and calloused, clamped onto her shoulder. Hannah nearly gasped, her heart surging into her throat, but the grip didn't crush. It anchored. Through the white haze, the sharp features of Seo Jin-wook materialized. His eyes were narrowed against the gas, his slicked-back hair slightly disarrayed, but his controlled intensity had morphed into something feral. "The back exit is compromised," Hannah hissed, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the gas. The dots were moving to the service entrance. Jin-wook didn't ask how she knew. He didn't question the waitress who had just saved his life with a grease pencil warning. He simply nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. "Lead." Hannah stayed low, moving with the quiet focus of a ghost. She didn't head for the kitchen. That was where they would expect them. Instead, she guided him toward the laundry chute disguised behind a mahogany panel near the private dining suites. Behind them, muffled shouts in Italian and Korean echoed through the fog. A stray bullet shattered a magnum of wine on the wall above them, raining dark liquid like blood down Hannah's crisp white collar. She didn't flinch. "In here," she whispered, shoving the panel open. It was a narrow, vertical service shaft used for whisking soiled linens to the basement. It was tight, dark, and smelled of bleach. "You first," Jin-wook commanded. His voice was steady, but she could hear the predatory rhythm of his breathing. Hannah tucked her skirts, ignored the burning in her lungs from the halon, and slid into the dark. The descent was a blur of steel and gravity, ending abruptly in a bin of damp tablecloths 3 floors down. A second later, the bin groaned under Jin-wook's weight as he landed beside her. He was out of the bin before she could breathe, his hand reaching back to haul her up. The basement was a labyrinth of concrete and industrial pipes, humming with the sound of the building's heart. "My car is in the VIP garage," Jin-wook said, his hand sliding to the small of her back, steering her toward the service elevator. "No," Hannah snapped, her self-assured voice surprising even her. "They're tracking the garage. They have the CCTV feed." Jin-wook paused, his eyes searching hers in the dim basement light. He saw the luminous skin now smudged with soot, the immaculate bun beginning to fray, and the cold, analytical fire in her gaze. He realized then that he wasn't looking at a waitress, he was looking at a tactician. "Then how do we get out?" he asked. "The laundry han." Hannah pointed toward a heavy steel door at the far end of the corridor. "It's scheduled to leave in 2 minutes. The driver is a creature of habit. He won't check the back." As they moved toward the door, a heavy thud echoed from the shaft they had just exited. The hounds had found the chute. Jin-wook reached into the waistband of his tailored trousers and pulled out a sleek black handgun. He didn't look like a man right at a dinner table anymore. He looked like the sovereign of a brutal empire. "Hannah," his voice dropped to a low, electric frequency, "if we get on that van, there is no going back to the restaurant. You become part of this. Do you understand?" Hannah looked at the steel door, then back at the man who had the city's lights in his eyes. She thought of her father's rising debt and the invisible life she had been leading, a life that was almost taken by a vintage bob and a pearl earring. "I was never just a waitress, Mr. Seo." her posture upright and composed, even in the shadows of the basement. "Let's go." The laundry van smelled of industrial detergent and damp cotton, a claustrophobic sanctuary that bounced violently as it cleared the service ramp. Hannah sat pressed against the cold metal ribs of the vehicle, her immaculate bun finally surrendered to the chaos, dark strands of hair framing her face. Opposite her, Seo Jin-wook sat on a pile of bundled linens, the suppressed handgun resting across his knee. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped an assassination. He looked like a man performing a cold audit of his own life. The van came to a halt 20 minutes later inside a nondescript warehouse on the edge of the industrial district. The rear doors swung open, revealing a wall of 4 men in tactical gear. They didn't look like the guards from the restaurant. These men stood with a rigid, lethal discipline. "Boss," one of them said, stepping forward. He glanced at Hannah, his hand twitching toward his sidearm. "Who is the civilian?" "She isn't a civilian," Jin-wook said, his voice dropping into that controlled intensity that commanded the room. "She's the reason I'm breathing. Get us to the penthouse, sweep the perimeter. If I see a single auburn hair within 5 miles of this block, I want a head on a plate." They were whisked into a private elevator that moved with silent, nauseating speed. When the doors opened, Hannah stepped into a world of glass, steel, and cold light. It was a high-rise fortress overlooking the frozen lake, stripped of the old-world glamour of the restaurant and replaced with the brutalist efficiency of a command center. Jin-wook turned to her, stripping off his blood-stained suit jacket. He tossed it onto a Mies van der Rohe chair and walked toward a wall of monitors. "Talk," he commanded. Hannah stood in the center of the room, her posture upright despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "The signal was a mobile banking app, Mr. Seo. Valentina wasn't checking her balance. She was watching a localized GPS feed. Your security detail at the bar didn't react because they were synchronized to the same server. They weren't your men. They were contractors." Jin-wook paused, his back to her. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "My intelligence team spent 6 months vetting that detail. My brother hand-picked them. How does a waitress see what my analysts missed?" "I was a candidate for the National Clandestine Service, Mr. Seo," Hannah said, her calm, professional voice cutting through the tension. "I washed out because my father's kidneys failed, and I couldn't maintain the travel schedule. I didn't stop being an analyst. I just started analyzing customers instead of terrorists." Jin-wook walked toward her, stopping only inches away. He was a foot taller, a wall of tailored white shirt and sharp features. The subtle neck tattoo seemed to pulse in the dim light. "You're a human lie detector," he murmured, his gaze searching her luminous skin for any sign of a tremor. "I'm an observer," she corrected, "and right now I'm observing that you're looking for someone to blame. Don't blame your team for being blind. Blame them for being loyal to the wrong Kang." Jin-wook's jaw set, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her face before he caught himself. "Valentina was a mistake, a blind spot I allowed because she was the daughter of a man I needed. But you," he gestured to the monitors showing the city below, "you saw the red dots before the first shot was fired." "I did." "Good," Jin-wook said, his voice turning into a cold, predatory whisper. "Because the restaurant was just the opening act. My brother won't stop until he sees a body. And since you're the only one who can spot his hounds before they bite, you aren't going back to that apron, Hannah Gold." He walked to a sleek console and pressed a button. A screen flickered to life, showing a high-definition feed of a hospital room. Hannah's breath hitched. It was her father, sleeping peacefully in his medical bed. "He's been moved to my private wing now," Jin-wook said, not looking at her. "He has the best surgeons in the country now. No more debt, no more invisible life." Hannah felt the golden cage closing around her. It wasn't a gift, it was a tether. "And what do you want in exchange, Mr. Seo?" Jin-wook turned, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the monitors. I want your eyes, Hannah. I want you to look at every person I trust and tell me which one is holding the knife. The silence of the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the servers and the distant, muffled sound of the city. Hannah stared at the monitor showing her father. He looked smaller than she remembered, his frail form tucked under linens far finer than any they had ever owned. She should have felt relief, but instead she felt the cold realization of the logic-patched trap she had walked into. You didn't just move him for his health, Hannah said, her voice echoing off the glass walls. You moved him because he's the only variable you can use to ensure I don't walk out that door. Jin-wook didn't deny it. He poured a finger of amber liquid into a crystal glass, the ice clinking with a sharp, final sound. Trust is a luxury I can't afford right now, Hannah. You saw how easily my own blood turned on me. I need you focused, and you can't be focused if you're worrying about hospital bills or whether a hound is waiting for you at your apartment. He sat behind a desk made of a single slab of dark oak, his sharp features illuminated by the blue glow of a tablet. Speaking of your apartment, we have a problem. Hannah moved closer, her poised gait returning as her analytical mind overrode her fear. The tracker? You think they followed the van? No, we swept the van. It was clean, Jin-wook said, sliding the tablet across the desk toward her. They didn't need a physical bug. They used your digital footprint. Valentina knew exactly which restaurant you worked at. 5 minutes after we vanished, someone bypassed the steakhouse's firewall. They didn't go for the sales records. They went for the HR files. Hannah looked at the screen. It was a log of the breach. They have my home address, my social security number, my father's previous clinic location. They were at your flat 10 minutes ago, Jin-wook stated coldly. My team intercepted their comms. They didn't find you, so they trashed the place. They're looking for anything they can use to find your weakness. Fortunately for you, I'm the only one who knows where your father is now. Hannah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the penthouse's climate control. This wasn't just a hit, it's a purge. If they're willing to go after a waitress's records that quickly, they have someone inside the city's data infrastructure. Precisely, Jin-wook said, stood up and walked to the window. My brother, Juno, has spent years investing in tech firms that are actually fronts for surveillance. He doesn't just want my chair, he wants to be the one who sees everything. He wants to be the eye. But he's arrogant. He thinks he can find everyone through a screen. He turned back to her, his gaze cool and deliberate. He doesn't realize I have a human element he can't code. You. You didn't use an algorithm to see Valentina's betrayal. You used your eyes. And now he's looking for me because I'm the one piece of evidence he didn't account for, Hannah whispered. You're not just evidence, Hannah. You're my counter-offensive. Jin-wook tapped a key on his desk and the wall of monitors shifted. Dozens of faces appeared, men in suits, women in evening gowns, bodyguards and associates. These are the stakeholders attending my brother's investor gala in 3 days. Half of them are already on his payroll. I need you to memorize every face, every tell, and every connection. Hannah looked at the sea of faces. It was a massive amount of data, the kind that would take a team of analysts weeks to parse, but her mind was already beginning to categorize them. The way one man gripped his lapel, the shifty eyes of a legal counsel, the aggressive posture of a rival boss. If I do this, Hannah said, looking Jin-wook directly in the eye, if I help you dismantle your brother's coup, I want more than just my father's safety. I want a seat at the table where the decisions are made. I'm done being invisible, Mr. Seo. A slow, predatory smile spread across Jin-wook's face, the first genuine expression she had seen from him. It wasn't a smile of kindness, but of recognition. He saw the survivor beneath the server. "Careful, Hannah Gold," he murmured, stepping into her personal space. "The view from the table is beautiful, but the food is always poisoned. Are you sure you're ready to stop serving and start eating?" Hannah didn't flinch. She adjusted her sharp white collar, her expression calm and self-assured. "I've spent years watching people eat, Mr. Seo. I know exactly how to spot the poison." The training didn't involve firearms or hand-to-hand combat. Jin-wook was smart enough to know that a week of practice wouldn't turn a civilian into a soldier. Instead, he weaponized her existing brilliance. For 3 days, Hannah lived in a world of high-definition surveillance feeds and encrypted data streams. Her workspace was a semicircle of monitors that projected the cold, digital pulse of an empire under siege. Jin-wook stayed behind her, his presence a constant, heavy weight. He didn't hover, he watched her process information, his controlled intensity matching her own quiet focus. "Look at the way the underbosses enter the room," Hannah murmured, pointing to a feed from a private club Jin-wook still controlled. "In the restaurant, they were deferential. Now look at their center of gravity. They aren't leaning toward you anymore. They're leaning toward the exits or toward each other." "Shifting loyalties," Jin-wook noted, his voice a low rasp. "They're smelling blood in the water." "No," Hannah corrected, zooming in on a man in a charcoal suit. "They aren't smelling blood. They're waiting for a signal. Look at his hand. He's checking his watch every 90 seconds. He's not bored, he's synchronized." She spent hours cross-referencing the guests of the upcoming gala with the security logs from the Obsidian. She didn't look for weapons, she looked for tells. She found that 3 of Jin-wook's primary financiers had recently moved large sums of cryptocurrency into accounts linked to his brother, Juno. But the biggest discovery wasn't a bank transfer. "Stop," Hannah said, freezing a frame of Valentina, the auburn fox, leaving a discreet boutique in the Gold Coast. "Enhance the reflection in the window." As the image sharpened, the vintage bob of the fiancé was visible, but so was the person she was meeting. It was a man whose face was partially obscured by a hat, but on his wrist sat a rare skeletonized tourbillon watch with a distinct sapphire blue on the crown. "I've seen that watch before," Hannah said, her brow furrowing. "Table 4, 2 weeks ago. He was dining with your head of security, Marcus." Jin-wook's jaw sat so hard Hannah heard the bone click. Marcus had been with the Kang family for a decade. He was the one currently standing outside the penthouse door, supposedly guarding them. "You're sure?" Jin-wook asked, his eyes fixing on the tiny blue spark on the screen. "I never forget a detail from a table I've served, Mr. Seo." He ordered his steak blue rare and complained about the temperature of the Cabernet. People who are that meticulous about their food are just as meticulous about their betrayals. Jin-wook didn't call for his guards. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply looked at Hannah with a terrifying level of respect. "You've done more in 72 hours than my entire counterintelligence wing did in a year." "They were looking for assassins," Hannah said, leaning back in her chair, her luminous skin pale under the monitor glow. "I was looking for the people who think they're too smart to be caught." "Juno thinks he has won because he has the guns and the codes," Jin-wook said, walking to a floor-to-ceiling window. The Chicago skyline was a jagged crown of ice. "He doesn't realize I have the oracle. He thinks you're just a waitress he needs to liquidate. He doesn't know you're the one dismantling his web thread by thread." "He'll find out at the gala." "Yes, he will." Jin-wook turned, his subtle neck tattoo dark against his pale skin. "But you won't be in the surveillance room for that, Hannah. I need you on the floor. I need the invisible eye to walk through the lion's den. If Marcus is compromised, he'll have his own men on the perimeter. I need you to spot them before the first toast." Hannah looked at her hands. They were steady. The poised, dark-skinned woman she had been at the restaurant was still there, but she was being forged into something sharper. "I'll need a dress," she said, her voice self-assured and cold. "Something that says I've stopped serving the wine and started owning the cellar." Jin-wook stepped closer, his gaze lingering on her. "You'll have whatever you want. Just remember, Hannah, once you walk into that gala as my partner, the world will never ignore you again. You'll be a target for the rest of your life." "I've been a target since I stepped to table 1, she replied. "I might as well be a target with a crown." The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard as Hannah cross-referenced the guest list for the 3rd time. The Eye of the Serpent was no longer just a title, it was her reality. She sat surrounded by holographic projections of the city's elite, her neatly swept-back hair finally beginning to loosen as she leaned into the data. Jin-wook entered the room, his tailored black suit replaced by a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the corded muscle of his forearms. He carried a tablet that pulsed with a red notification. "Juno sent the invitation," he said, his voice flat. "It's not just a gala. He's calling it an inauguration. He's not even waiting for me to be dead to claim the chair." Hannah didn't look up from her screen. "He's a narcissist, Jin-wook. Narcissists don't want to just win, they want an audience to witness the coronation. But he's made a mistake. He's invited the one person he thinks is his greatest asset, but who is actually his biggest leak." "Valentina?" Jin-wook asked, leaning over the desk. "No, not her. He expects you to be suspicious of her now," Hannah said, swiping a profile onto the main monitor. It was the man with the sapphire-crowned watch, the one she had seen meeting Valentina in the boutique reflection. "This is Silas Vane. He's the lead architect for Juno's tech fronts. He's also the man who designed the security protocols for the gala's venue." She zoomed in on Vane's wrist. "I saw him at table 4 2 weeks ago. He wasn't just complaining about the wine, he was sketching something on a napkin. At the time, I thought it was a design. Now, I realized it was a blind spot map of the ballroom." Jin-wook's jaw set as he stared at the map Hannah had reconstructed from her memory of that napkin. If he's the one who built the cage, he's the only one who knows where the bars are weak. "Exactly," Hannah said, her eyes lowered in quiet focus as she analyzed the blueprints. "Juno thinks he's surrounded you with hounds. He doesn't realize that I've already found the tunnel out." The emotional weight of the betrayal finally seemed to hit Jin-wook. He looked at the image of his brother, a man who shared his blood but none of his honor. The controlled intensity in his eyes flickered with a brief, raw flash of pain before hardening back into ice. "He was my brother," Jin-wook said, more to himself than to her. "I gave him everything. I built this empire so he wouldn't have to get his hands dirty." "And that's why he hates you," Hannah said softly, standing up and walking toward him. She stopped just outside his personal space, her luminous skin catching the moonlight from the window. "And you? What do you want, Hannah Gold? You have the debt cleared, your father is safe. Why are you still here?" "Because for 3 years I was a ghost," she replied, her voice self-assured and ringing with a new kind of power. "I served people who didn't know my name. I saw their crimes and their lies, and I could do nothing. You gave me the one thing I thought I'd lost forever: agency. I'm not just watching the play anymore, I'm rewriting the ending." Jin-wook reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture of controlled intensity, but for the first time it felt like an invitation rather than a command. "Then let's give my brother the show he deserves," he murmured. The moment was interrupted by a sharp chime from the console. Hannah turned back to the screen, her professional mask sliding back into place. "The tactical dress arrived," she said, her voice returning to its calm professional clip. "And the bugs I requested. If I'm going to walk into that room as your partner, I'm going to make sure every word Juno whispers is recorded for the entire board to hear." Jin-wook nodded, the serpent fully returned. "Get ready." We leave at midnight. By tomorrow morning, the city will either belong to my brother, or it will know that the king isn't dead. He just has a new queen." Hannah looked at the black silk gown draped over the sofa. It was elegant, classic, and lethal. She was no longer the waitress at table 1. She was the shadow in the machine, and the auburn fox was about to find out what happens when the hounds are outsmarted by the eye. The inauguration gala was held at the Obsidian's rival, a glass cathedral of excess perched 60 stories above the city. The atmosphere was a calculated performance of old-world glamour, but to Hannah's eyes, it was a battlefield. She stepped out of the elevator, her luminous skin radiating against the black silk of her tactical gown. The dress was a masterpiece of classic fine dining elegance, reimagined for war. It was floor-length, with a high, sharp collar that mimicked her old server's uniform, but the back was open, and a slit up the thigh allowed for the hidden holster strapped to her leg. Beside her, Seo Jin-wook was a shadow made of controlled intensity. He wore no mask. He didn't need one. His sharp features were set in a mask of cold indifference, but his hand on Hannah's waist was a grounding wire. "Remember," he murmured, his breath a warm contrast to the chilled air of the ballroom, "you aren't here to serve, you're here to judge." "I've been judging this room for 3 years, Jin-wook," her voice self-assured and low. "Tonight, I just have the power to do something about it." As they entered the ballroom, a vacuum of silence followed them. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd like a virus. The king was supposed to be dead, or at least in hiding. Seeing him walk in with a poised, dark-skinned woman who looked like a queen rather than a victim sent a shockwave through Juno's carefully constructed guest list. Across the room, standing on a raised dais, was Juno. He was a softer, more arrogant version of his brother, lacking the subtle neck tattoo and the raw edge that made Jin-wook a legend. Beside him stood Valentina, her auburn hair styled in an even more elaborate bob, her pearl drop earrings catching the light as she froze, her glass of champagne trembling in her hand. "The auburn fox looks like she's seen a ghost," Hannah whispered, her eyes lowered in quiet focus as she scanned the perimeter. "She's about to see a reckoning," Jin-wook replied. Hannah detached herself from him with the grace of a seasoned socialite. This was her role. While Jin-wook drew the eyes of every guard and underboss, she became the invisible eye once more. She moved through the crowd, her posture upright and composed. She didn't look for guns. She looked for the tells she had memorized in the penthouse. She spotted Silas Vane near the buffet, his sapphire-crowned watch glinting. As she passed him, she didn't stop, but her hand brushed his pocket with the practiced light touch of a server clearing a crumb. A tiny, high-frequency bug was now anchored to his coat. She moved toward the bar, noticing the short-sleeved man from the restaurant now dressed in a tuxedo that still didn't fit his bulky frame. He was standing near the emergency override panel. Hannah caught his eye and gave him a faint, professional nod, the same nod she gave every regular. The man flinched, his controlled intensity breaking for a split second as he realized the waitress was here, and she wasn't afraid. "Ladies and gentlemen," Juno's voice boomed over the speakers, amplified and hollow, "tonight we celebrate the future, a future of transparency, a future where the Kang Empire is no longer ruled by shadows." "He's going to play the confirmation recording," Hannah's voice crackled in Jin-wook's earpiece. She had reached the sound booth, tucked behind a velvet curtain. "He thinks he has the audio of you ordering a hit on the Russian council. He's going to use it to justify your execution to the board." "Can you flip the feed?" Jin-wook's voice calm in her ear, as he stood in the center of the room, surrounded by Juno's men. "I'm not just flipping it," Hannah said, her fingers flying across a hidden tablet she had pulled from her thigh holster. "Now," she whispered. The giant screens behind Juno didn't play the doctored audio of Jin-wook. Instead, they flickered to life with the high-definition footage Hannah had pulled from Valentina's own hidden cloud. The video of them and Juno in the boutique, laughing as they watched the live feed of the restaurant hit. The ballroom went deathly silent. Juno's face turned a sickly shade of gray. Valentina dropped her glass, the crystal shattering like a sound of a gunshot. "Your inauguration has a few plot holes, Juno," Jin-wook's voice rang out, no longer a whisper, but a roar that filled the cathedral of glass. Hannah stepped out from behind the curtain, her luminous skin glowing under the spotlight. She wasn't the ghost of the Obsidian anymore. She was the witness, the judge, and the executioner's hand. "The hounds are here," Hannah said, looking directly at Valentina. "But they aren't yours anymore." The silence in the ballroom was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the hundreds of guests. On the towering digital screens, the looped footage of Juno and Valentina's betrayal played with merciless clarity. The auburn fox stood paralyzed, her vintage bob disheveled as she looked at the image of her own laughing face, a face that had just signed the death warrants of everyone in the room. Juno was the first to break. He reached for the suppressed weapon tucked into his waistband, his face twisted into a mask of desperate rage. "Kill them!" he shrieked, pointing at the center of the floor. "Kill them all!" But the short-sleeved man and the other guards didn't move. They stood frozen, their eyes darting from the screens to the man with the subtle neck tattoo who stood like a monolith in the center of the room. Hannah's digital strike hadn't just exposed the betrayal, it had decapitated Juno's authority. A mercenary only fights as long as they believe their employer is winning. "The board has seen enough," Hannah's voice rang out from the sound booth, amplified by the same speakers Juno had intended to use for his coronation. She stepped into the light of the upper gallery, her luminous skin shimmering. "The funds you promised these men, Juno, they were diverted 3 minutes ago. You're not a king. You're a bankrupt ghost." Jin-wook moved then. He didn't run. He walked toward the dais with the controlled intensity of a predator who had already won. The crowd parted like water before a shark. As he reached the steps, he looked up at his brother, his sharp features devoid of the pain he had felt in the penthouse. There was only the cold, hard logic of the serpent left. "You thought the power was in the chair, Juno," Jin-wook said, his voice a low rumble that carried to every corner of the room. "You thought it was in the guns, but the power is in the eyes that see the knife before it strikes." He turned slightly, extending a hand toward Hannah, who stood in the gallery. "And my eye sees everything." The standoff lasted only seconds. Realizing the tide had turned, the men Juno had hired dropped their weapons. Valentina collapsed to her knees, her pearl drop earrings clicking against the marble floor as she began to sob, a sound of pure, selfish terror. Juno lunged for Jin-wook, a final pathetic act of defiance. Jin-wook didn't even draw his weapon. He caught his brother's wrist with a sickening crack, disarming him in one fluid motion and forced him to the floor. "Take them," Jin-wook commanded. His real security detail, the men who had been waiting for Hannah's signal, emerged from the shadows to haul Juno and Valentina away. The inauguration was over. The purge had begun. An hour later, the ballroom was empty of its finery, the old-world glamour shattered along with the champagne flutes. Hannah stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the first snow of December fall over Chicago. She still wore the black silk gown, but the pristine white apron of her old life felt like it belonged to another century. Jin-wook approached her from behind. He didn't touch her, but his heat radiated through the silk of her dress. "My father?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the snow. "Safe. He's already been moved to the estate's medical wing. He'll have the best care for the rest of his life, Hannah. That was my promise." Hannah turned to face him. Her neatly swept-back hair was gone, dark waves falling over her shoulders. She looked at the man who started as a stranger at table 1 and had become the architect of her new reality. And what happens to the invisible eye now? The restaurant is gone. The secret is out. Jin-wook reached out, his fingers finally tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb lingering on her bottom lip. The world knows your face now, Hannah Gold. They know you're the one who dismantled a coup with a grease pencil and a tablet. You can never be invisible again. He stepped closer, his controlled intensity softening into something deeper, something that looked dangerously like devotion. I told you that once you sat at the table, the food would always be poisoned, but I forgot to mention that the king doesn't eat alone. Hannah looked at the city below, the empire they had reclaimed together. She realized then that she hadn't just survived, she had transformed. She was no longer the server of the elite, she was the one who decided who was allowed to sit at the table. I think I'm ready to start eating, Jin-wook, she said, her voice self-assured and cold as the winter wind. Jin-wook smiled, a dark, regal expression. He leaned in, his lips brushing furs, as the snow covered the city in a fresh white shroud, hiding the blood of the night and making everything look clean and new. Underneath, the violence remained, the empire remained. But as they stood together against the glass, the waitress and the serpent, they knew that from this night on they would never be surrounded again. They were the ones who did the surrounding. Power doesn't need noise. It doesn't argue. It simply decides. Tonight, everything was revealed. Masks fell. Illusions shattered. And what remained was control. This story is finished. The game is over. If this story held your attention, if the silence, the tension, the details stayed with you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. We share more stories like this: betrayal, romance, and revenge.